Ladies and gentlemen, Michigan Democrats just gave us what would be the most radical United States senator in the history of the institution if elected.
You know, they think they want to use my whole name against me. Mike, listen, man, if you can't say the name, it's Abdurrahman, keep the name out your damn mouth. I'll be happy to give you lessons.
I'm Rich Lowry of National Review, and that was Abdul El-Sayed after winning his historic primary victory in Michigan very narrowly, more narrowly than the polls forecast, but it was a win, and he's going to face Republican Mike Rogers, and he was clapping back at Rogers in his typical charming fashion. It's my contention, and what I'm going to prove to you in this video, is that if he's elected, he would be the most extreme member of the United States Senate ever. El-Sayed would be more radical than the so-called radical Republicans. He'd be more radical than Huey Long, who so freaked out FDR during the 1930s, more radical than what used to be the leftmost edge of the Democratic caucus circa 1980s or so, Paul Wellstone, Tom Harkin, kind of these farmer Midwestern progressives, and more radical even than Bernie Sanders. So let's first go to another clip that I think is very telling. Again, this is the morning after his victory.
Mike, I'm going to say right here, I know you're going to say no because you're a coward. 5 debates, all right? Yeah. If you're willing to stand with me and have a conversation, you and I both know that you will wither in front of your own crimes. But I'm going to make sure Michiganders know about them. Because at the time we're done, you are not going to have safe quarter from people holding you accountable to what you've done for them.
So this caught my attention because crimes? What crimes is Mike Rogers allegedly guilty of? This inoffensive establishment-type Republican who's a former congressman. When he was in the House, he was a respected chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. I don't think he was committing any crimes chairing a House committee. Is he referring, though, to his military service? He was in the U.S. Army in the mid-1980s, but I'm not aware of war crimes committed by the U.S. military in the mid-1980s. Or is he referring to his service with the FBI? He was an agent in the Chicago office fighting organized crime and public corruption. So how was he committing crimes as an FBI agent? This is a profoundly weird thing to say and kind of an un-American thing to say. This is not the way we think of people who've served in the U.S. military or the FBI. It's how our enemies abroad might think of those people. But this is very perverse and weird and gets to my case that would be the most radical senator we've ever seen. So I think there's several dimensions to this. One, there's the pure economics, where he agrees with Bernie Sanders, he agrees with Zoran Mamdani. He is on the leftmost fringe of the Democratic Party on these issues. He's foursquare, totally for Medicare for all, for instance. So you can't get to his left on that stuff. Then there are these two other dimensions. Woke cultural politics. He has all the typical extreme views on trans. He wants to abolish ICE. He talked about defunding the police after the killing of George Floyd, kind of backed off of that a little bit, as so many lefties have. But this is a cultural dimension that just didn't exist for the likes of Huey Long, say, or even Tom Harkin in the 1980s. Even Bernie Sanders, he's on board all that stuff now, but he kind of had to make a turn when he saw that's where the left was headed. In his heart, what he really cares about is the economics rather than the woke stuff. But El-Sayed is totally on board that agenda as well. And then you have this whole other dimension of a radical third worldism and a hostility to Western civilization expressed, as is so often the case with these DSA-type candidates. He's not formally DSA himself, expressed in an unremitting hostility to Israel.
I just think we need to treat Israel the way we would treat any other country who behaved the way that Israel is behaving. I understand that Netanyahu is a big reason why they've gotten so aggressive and, frankly, so bloodthirsty under his reign. But I also understand that it's impossible for us to say that we want a two-state solution while we've been aiding, arming, and abetting the very people who've been trying to foreclose on the possibility of a Palestinian state. And ultimately, in the end, I don't think any of us pay our taxes so that a foreign government gets a bomb or a tank. We pay our taxes so that our kids get good schools and functional infrastructure, and too many of our kids just don't have those things right now.
Now, bloodthirsty is a very loaded term there and very typical of how he speaks of the Jewish state. Now, it's certainly true, Israel has had to wage all sorts of battles around the region since October 7th, which was literally a bloodthirsty pogrom carried out on Israeli territory against the Jewish state's men, women, and children. But he would never focus or dwell on that, right? It's only on the unique evil of Israel. And he also wants to portray as, oh, this is just a foreign government I oppose like any other foreign government. No, it is one he is totally obsessed with. I have to say, though, this is quite a polished answer and pretty effective in sheer demagogic terms in creating this opposition that doesn't exist in reality between foreign aid to this one country he's obsessed with and the welfare of Michiganders. Now, there's more where that came from.
Can you clarify for us what your position is on funding for Israel if you do become a U.S. Senator? Are you opposed to all funding for Israel, period, military funding?
I'm opposed to unconditional military aid for any country. That is Israel, yes, but that's also Egypt, where my family immigrated from. That's Pakistan, that's Saudi Arabia, that's UAE. And that's not because of a focus on what's happening anywhere except for a focus on what's happening here. We've got communities in my state where the median income is $14,000, and I believe they have a right to their tax dollars. I also believe in international law and upholding international law, and there are Leahy laws against dealing arms to countries who are engaged in human rights abuses. And I don't want to fund a foreign military that does genocide, apartheid, or has taken us to a war we don't need to fight. I believe in equal rights to peace, dignity, and self-determination for Jewish Israelis and Palestinians alike. I believe our responsibility, though, more than anything else, is to use our tax money here in Michigan to provide health care in Michigan, and schools in Michigan, and roads in Michigan, rather than to send it to a foreign government that might use it in the form of bombs and tanks to destroy infrastructure and schools and hospitals there.
Now, again, that's a very fluid presentation of his point of view for his purposes. But if you examine what he says there a little more closely, it all falls apart and doesn't really make any sense. Now, if all foreign aid is in effect being taken from the mouths of children in Michigan, that should apply, as he briefly refers to there, to all sorts of countries. Yes, Israel gets a lot of foreign aid. So does Ukraine. So does Jordan. So does Congo. So does Nigeria, down the list. So he should oppose all of that if it really is a parasitical program that is leaching Americans, their vitality and their resources here at home. He should oppose all of it, including the aid to Ukraine, by the way. Now, to his credit, this is something I actually think he's correct on. He supports the Ukraine war, but all that aid being poured to Ukraine, in his worldview, is hurting Michiganders, but he's not going to be consistent on that. I referred in that CNN clip to families in Michigan in communities that make on average $14,000 a year. Those people are obviously struggling. We should adopt the policies best suited to helping them thrive. But he's suggesting their tax dollars are being taken from them and sent to Israel. People making $14,000 a year are not paying federal taxes. All the money is flowing to them rather than being taken from them. Then he refers to the Leahy law. Sounds terrible. Why are we violating this human rights law and giving aid to Israel? The Leahy law, despite the way he's portraying it there, and I'm not an expert, this is my understanding, it has to do with countries that routinely violate civil rights and they have military units that are death squads or the like, and they're ignoring their crimes. Then you cut off those units from U.S. aid. That is not the case with Israel. There are no death squads in the IDF. And then he throws around these words we hear so often. Israel's guilty of genocide. No, it's not. There's been a very destructive urban warfare in Gaza. But we've had talk, the last week or two about potentially a deal. Not sure we're going to get it. It'd be great if we could. A deal to disarm Hamas and rebuild Gaza. That's not the kind of thing you're even contemplating if you're trying to genocide an entire people. And Israel, as I've discussed in videos before, is not an apartheid state. Arabs in Israel have full political rights. Now, I cast all this in terms of his concern, touching concern for the welfare of school children in the United States. This doesn't make sense in at least two ways. One, funding for schools is overwhelmingly state and local. Most of it does not come from the federal government. So you have foreign aid to Israel, which is a drop of the bucket in the terms of the overall federal budget. And then you have federal funding for schools that is relatively small proportion of the overall funding. So this really has nothing to do with Israel whatsoever. Two, the performance of students, how well they do in schools, is not directly correlated to funding. It has to do with school discipline policies, with high expectations, with curricula, all of that. That's not directly correlated with spending. So none of that makes any sense unless you're going out of your way to find ways to make the case that the Jewish state is somehow harming American children. And this goes again to the broader worldview. I don't want to attribute anything that any of his family members think or believe directly to him, but it does give you indications of where he's coming from. Here was a recent headline from the Washington Free Beacon. Abdul El Sayed's father-in-law, a top donor to an El Sayed super PAC, is among top leaders of Muslim Brotherhood organization linked to terror funding. Here's another one from Fox News. El Sayed campaign backed by over $100,000 from dozens of members of group with alleged terror ties. And yet another from the Washington Free Beacon. It's all in the family. Abdul El Sayed's radical sister called for a stateless, communized society and was arrested for spitting on a cop. Just going to dwell on a few details in here because they are entertaining, if nothing else. So this is his maternal half-sister. She's a self-described queer Muslim activist and professor in the Department of Comparative Human Development at the University of Chicago. Uh-oh, that doesn't sound good. Who has advocated for a stateless, communized society, as the headline says, and called to abolish the police. She's the author of what she calls the funky commie queer novel, Everything for Everyone, an oral history of the New York Commune, alongside her bestie, co-author Emmy O'Brien, a, quote, trans communist who wrote the 2023 book, Family Abolition, Capitalism and the Communizing of Care. The novel is a fictionalized oral history of sex workers, anti-fascist militants, and survivors of all stripes who band together to create a radically new social order forged in the ashes of capitalist collapse. So again, all this goes to a deeply anti-Western point of view that would have been totally alien to a Charles Sumner who just wanted to make sure that blacks were finally brought into the American political order and afforded the rights they deserved, or a Huey Long who was from Louisiana. He wasn't a cultural radical who didn't hate the country or its foundations or have any sympathy for our enemies, or a Tom Harkin, or even, again, before his turn, now he's kind of a leader in this tendency in his own right, a Bernie Sanders. There's a reason that El Sayed is one of Hassan Piker's favorite candidates this cycle. Piker, of course, the authoritarian far-left influencer who said once that we deserve September 11th and has sympathy for Israel's terrorist enemies over the Jewish state itself. There's a time not too long ago, say 10 years ago, when these views were completely fringe, and it would have been utterly unimaginable that someone holding all of them would potentially be elected to the United States Senate. But here we are. Read it and weep. Hey, by the way, comment, like, or subscribe. I promise you won't regret it. I'm Rich Lowry, over and out.